continue to join as we move forward through the webinar, and people are welcome to do that. Thank you for being here. Today's session is about a community-based research approach to suicide prevention and life promotion. This is the second of 3 webinars that are part of the Spring-Summer series hosted by Community-Based Research Canada. My name is Jess Notwell, and I'm the Community-Based Research Canada Program Coordinator and the moderator for today's session. This is the first webinar that I've moderated, so I'll ask you to be a tiny bit patient with me if I hesitate anywhere, but I'm really excited to be here with all of you. So Community-Based Research Canada, I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit about in case you don't already know. Our mission is to address real social problems through research as a national champion and facilitator for community-based research and community campus engagement across Canada. And for 10 years, we've brought together key players of community campus partnerships, and we continue to grow each year. Our network builds capacity for academia and broader communities to collaborate and use research as a tool to mobilize community participation and action, and all with the aim of addressing real social problems and achieving justice. We'd love to hear from you during this webinar. So of course, we have Amanda who will present, and I'll tell you a bit about her in a moment. But we also are really interested in your questions and comments and feedback on Amanda's presentation. And so we will ask you to please share your questions and comments in the chat box, either during the presentation as you think of them or after the presentation. And then we will have a facilitated discussion of about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the presentation. So if you're afraid you'll lose your thought, please write it down and we will come back to it so we won't lose that thread. In the question and answer period, it will be the very last part of the webinar before we do our very final evaluation and tell you to have a great day. So now, because I'm not really who you are here to hear from, so I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Amanda Demmer. And I'll just read a tiny bio about her. It's only tiny, so there's much, much more to know, and she'll tell you more, I think, during the webinar as well. So with a master's degree in community psychology, experience working in research, education, community mental health, and public health, and lived experience of suicidal thoughts and behaviors, Amanda brings a community-based and upstream approach to suicide prevention in her role as program coordinator for the Waterloo Region Suicide Prevention Council. Welcome, Amanda. You're welcome to start.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. My camera and my microphone are working. Okay. So thank you all for being here to listen to my presentation. I'm very excited to be sharing a little bit with you about how to use a community-based approach in suicide prevention and about the current research project we're working on here at the Waterloo Region Suicide Prevention Council. There are 4 things I'm going to try to cover today. First, I'll talk a little bit about just helping us to find a shared understanding of suicide and the prevention of suicide. We'll take a critical look at suicidology, which is the research of suicide and suicide prevention, and look at where community-based research can fit into that. I'll give you an example of community-based research in suicide prevention by talking a little bit about our current research project. And for closing, we'll do a bit of brainstorming about future community-based research in suicide prevention and what that could look like. So as I said, I'd be starting with this shared understanding of suicide, and we think it's very important to start with this just so we are all on the same page and have this understanding of suicide within the various perspectives that you might come from. So at the council, when we do presentations to the community, this is the definition or understanding of suicide that we give, and this is the understanding of suicide that we hope our community to have as we move forward. So we see suicide as being a complex issue that results from many factors and should not be attributed to any single cause. So some of the factors that are commonly acknowledged as potentially contributing to suicide include biological factors, psychological factors, social factors, cultural factors, spiritual factors, and economical factors, as well as many others. So we acknowledge that the factors that contribute to suicide aren't just individual level factors. There's also factors the macro level, in the exosystem, and in the macro level as well. When we are trying to help people understand kind of the mindset of someone who may be contemplating suicide, we often use this quote by Judith Springer, that suicide is an attempt to solve a problem of intense emotional pain with impaired problem-solving skills. And another quote I have up on the slide here is one that we often hear from individuals who have attempted suicide and lived through their attempt. They often tell us that they didn't want to die, but they're struggling to live. We don't see suicide as an active desire to die. Instead, we see it as struggling to live, either to cope with pain that they're dealing with, to find a meaning or purpose, or whatever reason that is that they're struggling to live in the moment. I see there's a comment that there's a hard time hearing me, so I'll try to speak as loudly as I can. Unfortunately, I can't get any closer to my microphone here. So I suggest you try increasing your volume if that's possible, and I'll do my best to speak as loudly as I can here. So to move on to talking about suicide prevention, the model I have up on the slide here is commonly the model used in the suicide prevention field. There's three aspects that we acknowledge within suicide prevention. We look at prevention, intervention, and postvention. So prevention in suicide prevention is often a lot of building resiliency, building coping skills, kind of supporting individuals to not get to the place where they reach a suicidal crisis. So giving them the skills they need to be able to support themselves through the struggles or tough times in their life without coming to crisis. There's kind of this emerging field in suicide prevention as well of life promotion. And life promotion really is that very upstream promotion of life and coping skills and resiliency that's come out of the suicide prevention field. Intervention is the next piece of suicide prevention, and this is the support for individuals in the moment that they're having a suicidal crisis. So intervention commonly involves crisis lines, emergency services, hospital departments, anything that supports a person in the moment of having the intense suicidal thought or of having attempted suicide. Postvention is the last piece of this, and postvention is really about the support after a crisis. So this can take different forms. Often we think of postvention in terms of supporting survivors of suicide, who are the loved ones left behind after the death of a suicide. So postvention can mean helping those individuals find a healthy place to grieve when the loved one has died by suicide. Postvention can also take the form of supporting someone after they've had their own suicide attempt, so supporting them to heal from that, to find meaning in their life, and find what their recovery journey will look like. Now at the Suicide Prevention Council, we've created this graphic to talk about the suicide prevention work we do. So we use the words hope, help, and healing instead of using those words prevention, intervention, postvention. That hope work really does summarize what prevention tries to do. Help is about the intervention piece, and healing is that postvention piece. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current field of suicidology, so the research of suicide. And I'll be pulling a little bit from this textbook, Critical Suicidology. And this was a textbook that my master's thesis supervisor gave me when I finished my master's thesis. And I was very grateful for it. It has some very interesting perspectives, some interesting ideas about how we can keep pushing forward the field of suicidology. In the introduction of this book, they look at kind of the current field of suicidology. They look at what suicide prevention and suicide research is being published in academic journal articles. What they found is that there really is a reliance on the field right now. There's a big focus on identifying and managing individual level risk factors. They found that suicide prevention research is really dominated by positivist research paradigms. It really aims to be empirical, systematic, objective, and there's a large reliance on quantitative data. This narrow focus on individual deficits in pathology and on these positivist research paradigms can exclude approaches that don't fit within that. So they also found that less than 3% of journal articles about suicide published between 2005 and 2007 had any form of qualitative research within them. So certainly the research we're seeing in suicide prevention is primarily quantitative. They argue in this introduction that there needs to be a shift, and not necessarily that the research being done isn't valuable. Certainly it has its value in its place, but there needs to be more of a balance where we're also looking at doing research that's qualitative, and that includes the insider knowledge and the local knowledge. They argue that we can start to also do research that's more community driven. So insider knowledge is the knowledge of individuals who have lived experience. So in the case of suicide research, insider knowledge could be individuals who have experienced their own suicidal thoughts or behaviors, who have lived through their attempt, who have lost a loved one to suicide, or the service providers working in the field. Including the local knowledge as well, starts to look at how we can do suicide prevention research within specific communities as opposed to trying to find these universal truths. Because we do acknowledge that there are different community level factors in play when it comes to suicide. So looking at community level intervention and utilizing that local knowledge may be a different way that we can start to move with suicide prevention research. So when I think about the current field of suicide prevention research, there are a few questions that come to my mind, and I'm going to kind of critically pose these questions and talk a little bit about them. One of the questions I have is, are suicide prevention efforts misaligned with our definition of suicide? I ask this because the definition of suicide I gave earlier, or that shared understanding, did acknowledge that there's economical factors, there's cultural factors, there's spiritual factors involved. It acknowledged that there is macro system influence. Yet when we look at the types of research being done and the types of prevention efforts, as I've mentioned in the book on critical suicidology, they talk about that the field is really dominated by a focus on individual level deficits and pathologies. So is there a misalignment there in that we acknowledge those other aspects do come into play, but we haven't started to look at how we can bring those into research yet? My second question is, where is the lived experience knowledge in academic literature? So the lived experience knowledge is out there. It exists in different forms. There are many great books and biographies and speakers who speak from the lived experience perspective. But what we're not seeing is that being included in the mainstream kind of academic literature, the journal articles. And a great example of this, my master's thesis looked at the stigma of suicide. So I really wanted to talk to those who had experienced their own suicidal behaviors. I wanted to talk to them about how they were stigmatized in our society. When I started doing my literature, I was blown away that no one previously had ever spoken to those who had been stigmatized to ask them about what that felt like. There was quite a lot of literature on suicide stigma, but it was asking members of the general community how they might feel towards someone who had attempted suicide. So that was a surprise to me that that lived experience perspective wasn't yet in the literature. And I think that would be common across a lot of suicide prevention research. My last question is there a gap between knowledge creation and implementation? And I wonder this because when we have a focus on the positivist research paradigm and this focus on quantitative research, the search for empirical facts and universal truths about suicide, does that create a gap in how quickly we can implement programs or strategies that may be working? We know that scientifically speaking and statistically speaking, numbers of suicide mortalities are low enough that it is hard to show when there's been a statistically significant change. So if we rely on quantitative measures, such as looking at suicide mortality to evaluate whether a program is effective or not, it may not show promise. And you see this when you do literature reviews of effective suicide prevention programs. Often you hear researchers saying that more research needs to be done or that practices show promise. But we haven't really found a good way of evaluating, I think, that takes into account this other knowledge and that looks at how we can increase the time or decrease the time it takes between when we do research and when we're able to really make action happen based on that research. What I'd like to propose is that community-based research can really start to fill these gaps. By doing research that's community-driven, we ensure that we are doing research that the community finds valuable. So if we ask the community what their gaps are, I think we would start to see more community-level factors being brought into research as opposed to the focus on individual-level factors. If we make research more participatory and ensure we include a cross-stakeholder perspective, we can start to include that lived experience knowledge and that local context knowledge that may be missing. And by doing research that's really action-oriented, that has a goal to make change in a community, we can start to close that gap between when we create knowledge and when we're able to take action or implement that knowledge. So I'll shift now to talking about our current community-based research project within Waterloo Region. And for those who may be from other parts of Canada, Waterloo Region is a community in Southern Ontario. And I want to start just by talking about our council, the Waterloo Region Suicide Prevention Council, because that is the context that the research is taking place within. So our council currently has 3 staff members. We have about, right now I think we have 18 board members, and we try to always include a variety of stakeholders on our board. So we have a board member, for example, who represents the lived experience perspective. We have one who represents bereaved individuals. We have representatives from the school boards, from the post-secondary institutions, from local first responders, from the hospitals. So we try to include many different perspectives on our council to drive the work that we do. On the slide here, I have our mission statement for the council, as well as our 4 key pillars. So our mission statement is believing that every person has the right to be supported in living a healthy, positive life. Our mission is to reduce suicidal behavior and its impact on individuals, families, and communities. The 4 key pillars that we do work within are community awareness, research and evaluation, training and education, and partnership and capacity building. So what we don't do is service provision. We don't provide clinical or counseling services. Instead, we're really the organization that supports those who do. So we do the community awareness to help individuals get a sense of what's available in our region. We support those service providers by providing capacity building. We do training and education for the public, and we do research and evaluation, like the current project we're working on. So to give you an idea of how this project came about, I wanted to give a little bit of history. So it was actually in 2016 when we had the idea to start this project, and it was born out of a community status report that Public Health, so Region of Waterloo Public Health and Emergency Services presented to the council and to the community. This was a status report on suicide and self-harm in our region. And the council and the community, when we saw the statistics available in our region, we kind of realized that the data available raised more questions than it gave answers. While there was very valuable information for us to know about our community in this report, it also helped us realize that there's a lot we don't know in terms of how we can make sure our services are the most effective and comprehensive. So from that, the community decided they wanted to start to do some research to gain more information and to make change in our community. So the Waterloo Region Suicide Prevention Council established a research priorities committee, and we began planning research. And here we did officially partner with the Region of Waterloo Public Health and Emergency Services. We're very thankful for their support. We certainly would not be where we are with this research project without the support of the region, and in particular the support of one of their epidemiologists, Jessica Deming, who I believe is watching today, so thank you, Jessica. 2018, we were able to finalize phase 1 of our research, and I'll speak a little bit more about what the different phases of research were, but phase 1 was kind of gathering additional quantitative data and ensuring that using the data that was already available, we had the best picture we could have of our community. And in 2019 is really when we started getting into the more community-based project, our phase 2, which is the qualitative work we're currently doing. And we partnered with the Center for Community-Based Research here in Waterloo. So again, another partner we're extremely thankful for. Their expertise has helped us really drive this project forward. So what are we actually doing in our research? We had a few goals. Some of the things that we're trying to do within our research, some of our objectives are to better understand who is dying by suicide and who is attempting suicide in Waterloo region. We wanted to explore current suicide prevention strategies and support in Waterloo region, and we wanted to utilize these findings to guide suicide prevention efforts here in our region. When we talk about wanting to better understand who is dying and who is attempting, note that we're saying we want to figure that out in our region. We're not searching for these universal risk profiles that could be applicable anywhere. We're really trying to get a picture of our region and what's going on and ensure that we have enough of a picture of what's going on to inform services. And we're going about collecting that information in various ways. This is our research design. So as I said, we had a first phase that was quantitative, which involved that partnership with public health, which was, again, collecting and analyzing local statistics, using various databases and sources we could get our hands on to ensure that, again, any information that was already out there that we could access, we've brought into this to help us broaden our picture of our community. And the second phase, which we're very excited about, is the qualitative community-based project. So we partnered with the Center for Community-Based Research. We've built a larger steering committee. And the first stage in this will be interviewing key stakeholders, such as service providers. And the second stage, we will be interviewing those with lived experience. The reason we're so excited to get these perspectives and bring them in the qualitative research is, again, a lot of the quantitative data we collected gave us more questions than answers, specifically a lot of why questions. One of the things that came out of the quantitative data was that our region here in Waterloo region does have higher rates of emergency department visits for self-harm than the average for Ontario. So we want to know why. What's special about our region? Is it that people are seeking help more? Is it that there are higher rates of suicide attempts or self-harm in our region? We don't know. So we're hoping to gather different perspectives on that and other issues, other perspectives that'll help us to inform our services here. Now, in this research design, one of the things that we're doing is making it extremely participatory. So I already shared how our research is community-driven. It was born out of that community interest to get a better picture. And it's highly participatory. So in this stage one, when we've been interviewing our key stakeholders and our service providers, we've actually trained the members of our steering committee to be part of the research team. So it's our steering committee members, as well as some staff at the Center for Community-Based Research, that are going out and collecting the data and doing the interviews and being involved in every step of the process. I should also mention that our steering committee does have a cross-stakeholder perspective. So our steering committee is made up of individuals who do have lived experience of suicidal ideation, thoughts, or behaviors, those who have lost loved ones to suicide or been touched by suicide in some way, and various service providers who have experience either in bereavement counseling or supporting individuals who are struggling themselves. So we tried to involve lots of different perspectives there and to keep a very high level of participation for those in our steering committee. The current status of our research, I've talked about kind of where we're at in phase 2 right now. We're doing interviews, qualitative, semi-structured interviews with service providers who have experience supporting either those who have attempted suicide or those family members of those who have died by suicide. That's currently underway. We're doing our interviews and collecting our data. Leading up to that, there was, of course, a lot of laying the groundwork, laying the foundation. So establishing the steering committee, ensuring we all had a shared understanding of perspective, even though we did come from different organizations, different backgrounds, different goals, different organizational mandates that might have been driving our work. We were able to find that shared vision for our steering committee so that we could find a research purpose, research questions, and research design that we all felt would be best. The other thing we're doing right now is working on knowledge mobilization for our phase 1 results. In phase 1, again, was the quantitative report, quantitative data that we did publish in a report through public health. And this has been really interesting. We didn't expect there to be a lot of interest in this because it wasn't necessarily new information. It was just gathering information from different sources to consolidate it. But we had quite a field day, 2 days after we released our report, of media requests coming in. Of course, the question that all media had for us is why? Why are our rates higher here? So what we really tried to do, we tried to monopolize on the media attention to help raise awareness and interest for the current community-based research we're doing. So when researchers came at us, or when the reporters came at us with that why question, we were able to say, we don't know, and we're doing more research to help figure that out. And here's the new research we're doing, and it's very community-based, and here's how people in our community can get involved in it. So as we're helping to disseminate the results of phase one, we're also kind of building that stakeholder engagement for the rest of our research project. So the next steps for our research, once we're done our stage one of phase two, which is the interview with key stakeholder service providers, we do plan to move into doing interviews with those with lived experience. And we separated that into separate phases so that we can really inform those interviews by what we gather from service providers first. So looking at who specifically we want to talk to, if there's specific groups or individuals we want to target, if there's anything we need to keep in mind when speaking to those with lived experience. We're hoping we gather some of that in speaking with service providers so that we can really ensure we're doing a good job when we speak to those with lived experience. Of course, the other step of this research is the knowledge mobilization and the community mobilization. This was very important to us as we entered into this project. We wanted it to be action oriented. That was our goal from day one. We wanted to do this research so that we can better understand our community, so that we can create change and support our community in growing and supporting the needs. The other thing we're looking at doing is creating some sort of toolkit for doing this type of research that we can share with other communities. So the Waterloo Region Suicide Prevention Council has always been seen as kind of a national leader. We're very fortunate here that we do have a strong council, that we have 3 full-time staff for a small local grassroots council. So we are able to use some of our capacity to support other communities looking to build that same capacity. So one of the ways we're hoping to do this is to create a toolkit or some steps or guidelines and give some presentations around that we are supporting other communities in building their capacity to do similar things. So I had a little bit of fun with this slide, coming up with ideas for future community-based research in suicide prevention. So I kind of put on my academic hat. If I were to ever go back for a PhD, what might some potential thesis topics be? So some of the areas of suicide prevention that I thought could really benefit from the community-based research perspective include the creation of public education campaigns. So we see lots of public education campaigns that look at reducing stigma, at giving knowledge to the general public on how they can support someone who's struggling. And we see public education campaigns around trying to encourage help-seeking behavior, so encouraging individuals to seek help if they're struggling. So I don't know a lot of these campaigns, how they're developed, but I imagine if they're developed from a community-based research perspective, where we involve lived experience and we look at local knowledge, targeting needs to local communities, that may help them in being more effective. Another area that I think community-based research could support us in is service planning within local communities. So similar to what we're doing here in Waterloo Region, our approach of the community-based research and gathering the cross-stakeholder perspective is really going to help us inform the service planning and any potential political advocacy or other work we can be doing to ensure our services here are effective and comprehensive. One of the other things I thought of was kind of addressing this idea of toxic masculinity that we're hearing a little bit more about in media, and there's being a bit of attention paid to this. This kind of comes from suicide prevention or suicide statistics show us that males do die by suicide at much higher rates than females. And I don't see that as a male versus female problem. We know that gender exists on different continuums, and how people express masculinity or femininity isn't necessarily defined by whether they identify as male or female. So I really see this as a masculinity problem. The characteristics of masculinity, we think of people telling young boys to tough it up, to be strong. Males have been portrayed, or masculine individuals have been portrayed as being the supporter, the caregiver, that kind of strong rock that can't show their emotions. And our society has started to talk about this and look at what detrimental effects that toxic masculinity may have. But I think taking a community-based approach to figuring this out will really help us. We need to involve those male perspectives, those masculine perspectives, if we're going to look at starting to break down these barriers. And the last area I came up with was empowering and supporting communities that may have elevated suicide risk. And I'll say this is an area where I have seen lots of great community-based research already coming out of. And I'll circle back to that book that I had on one of my earlier slides about critical suicidology. They give fantastic examples in that book of communities and places where community-based research is happening in suicide prevention. So we see communities like the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities that may have an elevated suicide risk doing this type of research. We see the LGBTQ2S++ community also doing some great community-based research. So some communities have started to really embrace this approach, but I think it can go a little more mainstream. And lastly, I do want to make sure I'm leaving time for questions, so I'll kind of skim through this a little bit, but I'm happy to expand if you have questions. I had some suggestions for doing community-based research within suicidology. My first suggestion was ensuring that we have a common, non-stigmatizing language of suicide that's used by the research team and the steering committee. So it's very important, again, when you have a cross-stakeholder steering committee, you have multiple perspectives, that each of those perspectives and whatever differing language they may use, sometimes researchers use different language than clinicians, use different language than someone with lived experience might. Someone with lived experience will often have their own way of talking about their experiences. So we need to respect that, and we need to find that common language so that no one is using language that may stigmatize someone else within the group. It's important that we meaningfully involve insider knowledge and local knowledge. So again, we need to make sure that we are getting those perspectives, but that we're getting them in a meaningful way. So this means having members with lived experience, having service providers as part of the steering committee, as part of the research team, not just as individuals you're trying to collect knowledge from with your data collection tools. The other thing I have down here, which of course is something we all minimize the risk for research participants. Project will be attempting to minimize risk for research participants. I think some ways we can do that when we're looking at suicide prevention research is ensuring that we are providing information on supports in our local communities to everyone we interview. And we're doing that in our research project. We're providing everyone with crisis information cards so that they can reach out to crisis services if they are feeling triggered or just wanting to have someone to talk to after anything that may be potentially triggering within our interview. Sorry, I'm just pausing. It looks like my computer is acting up. Can people still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you, and we're trying to figure out about the camera also.
Okay, as long as the audio is still working, I'll keep going.
Thanks.
So minimizing risk for research participants. The other thing I think when I think of that is when we are involving lived experience perspectives, we have to look at how we can do so safely. And my suggestion to ensure you do that is to connect with local suicide prevention experts in your community. The role we play in the Waterloo, when we hear about presentations or workshops or things about suicide prevention going on in our community, help the people putting those on to ensure that anyone speaking from lived experience is doing so safely. So usually that involves they're at a place in their recovery journey where they can safely speak about it without being re-triggered or re-traumatized, and they can speak about it in a way that won't potentially trigger or traumatize others listening to them. So looking at different standards and guidelines for sharing your story safely would be important, and then figuring out how to gauge readiness for participation for those with lived experience coming into the research project. The last suggestion I have is to, of course, strive for research excellence and to adhere to community-based research standards. Doing community-based research is phenomenal because we can use more creative and innovative ways, and we don't have to stick to traditional positivist research methods. However, that doesn't mean we can let research quality fall to the wayside. We still need to ensure that we have very high-quality research that we can stand behind. And the adherence to community-based research standards means that our research is community-driven, community-owned, it's participatory, it's action-oriented. If you're new to community-based research, I'm assuming most of the people here would be more familiar with it, but if you're new to community-based research, there's a fantastic article by the Center for Community-Based Research by Rich and Joanna there called Breathing Life into Theory that talks about the 3 hallmarks, the 3 functions, the 4 phases, and the various steps of community-based research. So that could be a great starting point if you're new to community-based research and looking at what those standards may be and how you can do a community-based research project. And that is it for what I have for everyone today. I very much encourage you to write in your questions and your comments. Let me know also if you have your own suggestions for future community-based research in suicide prevention, or if you're already doing projects that are community-based in suicide prevention. I'd love to hear from you. And thank you for being here, for watching, and for giving me this opportunity to share our work with you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us and to participate in the webinar, and for sharing your incredible experience and expertise around suicide prevention in terms of both your master's research and the work that you're doing now. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure that other attendees have as well. We are going to now just talk for a minute about the Community-Based Research Canada, and also give people one more opportunity to just write your questions in the chat box. And we would love to know what you think. If you have comments, any questions you have for Amanda, we would love to know more about what you're thinking. A recorded version of this webinar, as well as the slides, will be available on the Community-Based Research Canada website under the Resources tab. So if there are people that you know who had hoped to be able to get here today and weren't able to, please share that information. And also, if there's something that you think, oh, that fact was really important and I forget what it is, of course, you can go back and look at the webinar again at another time. So how can you get involved with Community-Based Research Canada, you might be wondering. We welcome for you to become a member as an institution or as an organization, as an individual person. Maybe you're faculty at a university or college, maybe you're a student. There's ways to become a member of Community-Based Research Canada. So if you're interested, please let us know. We also invite you to continue to join our webinars. So we try to do a webinar about once a month and have a presenter talk about their community-based research and different aspects of their own experiences, and people from across the country. So we invite you to continue to participate. If you are a community-based researcher yourself, we invite you to join the network. There's a map on the website, and you can actually submit your profile, and you can actually look at the map and also click on places across Canada and see who nearby where you are is doing research, and connect with them. And you can also send news and events from your organization or institution or yourself about community-based research to us at info@communityresearchcanada.ca. And then the news will be shared on the CBRC website as well. And finally, you can sign up for our mailing list by going to the newsletter page and entering your email address. And we produce a newsletter at least 3 times a year, and then we're sharing information about what's going on in community-based research across the country. So we welcome your continued involvement with community-based research. And now people have had a moment to think about questions. I'll start with a question, and then maybe that will also spark other people to think about your questions, and you're welcome to continue to write them in the chat box. So Amanda, one question is, so you talked about having lots of different stakeholders on the council and also on the steering committee for the research, and the importance of people bringing many, many different perspectives around suicide prevention. And so how did you navigate in that process, finding a common vision when different stakeholders have different goals or different organizational mandates?
Thanks, Jessica. That's a great question, and certainly that's something that does take some time to establish when you start working with different stakeholders. And there's an example I can give that I think is a great example of how we've been able to work collaboratively and find that shared vision even coming from different goals. So when we published the phase 1 report, the quantitative kind of look at statistics, we realized that our goal at the Waterloo Regional Suicide Prevention Council is to primarily we try to prevent harm. We want to ensure that no information going out to the community could potentially cause harm to anyone. We also want to provide information that will support suicide prevention.
Amanda, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but you've just gotten very quiet. May you please speak a little bit louder?
Sure, I'll try to speak as loud as I can.
Awesome.
So one example of where we've had to really navigate different perspectives of different stakeholders is when we were putting together and publishing the phase 1 report. So our perspective from the Waterloo Regional Suicide Prevention Council is to prevent harm from the community, so ensure no information going out to the community could be potentially harmful, and also to provide any information the community needs to prevent suicide. When we were looking at this phase 1 report, we came across the information on reducing access to means. And this was information that the council wasn't sure how to present. We wanted to ensure that when we talked about different methods for suicide accounts or suicide mortality, we weren't presenting it in any sort of sensationalized way. So I think our initial reaction at the council was, oh no, we can't share this information at all. And thankfully, our partner here was public health. Their perspective, and I hope I get this right, but their perspective is to provide information unbiasedly to the community so that service providers can utilize it. So their perspective was, we want to share that information because it can be valuable in different circumstances. So we had to look at navigating and finding a common ground there, where we had the same kind of vision to prevent suicide, but we had different kind of organizational mandates of how we could do that. So we were able to navigate that by having a collaborative discussion between the council and our steering committee and public health, and figuring out a way that we could still present that information to those who needed it without presenting it in a sensationalized way. We included some trigger warnings and method warnings in the report. We removed any of the tables or graphs that made that information more visual, so that it didn't pop out quite so much for someone just to come across it, but it was still there for those who needed it. So I think it was a fantastic compromise and a fantastic way that we had two organizations with different mandates, but that same goal that could come together and find that shared vision. So I guess that's an example that how to actually do that would really be just from the beginning, when you establish that steering committee, talking through what the goals of the different organizations are and ensuring we can get on the same page and have that shared vision. Ultimately, we all have the goal of preventing suicide, whether we do it from different perspectives or lenses. So it's a bit of negotiation there to ensure that there is that any compromise or collaboration that needs to be done happens at the beginning.
Thank you, Amanda, for explaining that. It's really helpful to get a better picture of the process. We also have a question that's come in on the discussion. How do you narrow down the numbers of communities in the size of a master's research, since communities, language, spiritual beliefs can be very diverse, as you talked about, or do you even narrow it down? The question says, I found that schools really encourage master's students to keep the size of research smaller than a PhD.
That's an interesting question. I think the nature of community-based research is that the research is coming from communities. So I think when you do research in that way, it already is narrowed down in a sense, that it's one specific community saying, hey, these are our issues, what can we do about them? So when the research is community-driven like that, when there's a specific community with a specific need that you come in to do community-based research on, you already have that narrow focus. And now I think the fact that as that question mentioned, there are different communities and languages and spiritual beliefs that are diverse. And I think that's just more reason why we have to narrow down. And the comment about keeping master's projects small, that's certainly something I encountered. I had this lofty goal of creating a strategy for reducing stigma informed by lived experience. And I had to very much narrow that down and instead say, I'm giving a hermeneutical, phenomenological perspective on suicide stigma from my community, and even more specifically, using those that went through one specific program within my community. So narrowing it down, I think, is just kind of, sometimes it's picking what's accessible. It's picking what community is already out there saying, hey, I need support, and figuring out what you can do with what's there, if that makes sense. And I hope that's an okay answer to that question.
Thank you, Amanda. That's helpful to understand your process, and then other people can think about it as they engage in their own processes also. And really appreciating your emphasis on community-based research being driven by the community, and that's part of narrowing that focus. That's really important. Thank you. I have another question, since I don't see another one in the chat, although people are still welcome to write them. What would be a starting point for a community looking to do similar research as the Waterloo Region Suicide Prevention Council is doing? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, so again, we're very fortunate here in Waterloo Region. Our council is very well respected, it's very well connected, and our council already had that diverse cross-sectional stakeholder perspectives right involved. So that was kind of our starting point. Just the fact that the council here is as strong as it is and has the partnerships and connections we have, it was very easy for us to then kind of start this type of research. So I think a starting point for communities looking to do this, if there isn't already a suicide prevention council or a coalition in existence, create one. If there is one in existence, but it doesn't have quite the same momentum, find ways to connect with different stakeholder perspectives and involve those in the work you're doing. Having a council or a group like that with different perspectives and different levels of expertise, I think, is a great starting point to then branch off and doing sort of community-based programming or research.
Thank you, Amanda, for sharing that perspective. We have another question on the chat. It says, I'm very new to community-based research and very curious to know how small sample study can be funded. Do you have any experience with this, with getting funding for these small sample sizes?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's more of a question probably for you at Community-Based Research Canada or the Centre for Community-Based Research. From my experience, I think I would say that if there's a community in need, they usually can find funding in one way or another. So the Waterloo Region Suicide Prevention Council, our funding is primarily third-party fundraisers that run for the community and donations from community members. And with our funding, we were able to get this research project going. So I would imagine that a lot of community-based research is community funded. I also think that community-based research projects, due to their nature of being community-driven and placed within a community, might not necessarily need the same level of funding as other studies, because we're using local knowledge. We're involving stakeholders and professionals and lived experience and other people in the research process. We're training people as researchers and as experts. So I think that just in the nature of community-based research, the funding might not necessarily be or might not need to be as large as what some people envision. And I don't know, Jess, if you want to add anything with your perspective of what you do for funding community-based research projects.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to add some thought. Different organizations or different community groups access different kinds of funding depending on the exact topic of the research and also the province or area that they're in. Certainly the community foundations across Canada, especially if it's a small study, are a good partner or potential partner to talk to. It is, I mean, in Waterloo region as an example, preventing suicide is extremely important everywhere, but here the statistics are showing that there's a higher rate of attempts, as Amanda has talked about, and so it becomes a regional priority, a regional responsibility, a community responsibility. And so community foundations are engaged in the kind of work that's looking at how do we make our communities healthier and stronger, and what are we responding to in order to do that. Other community partners might be the municipal or regional government where you live. You might, depending on where you are, connect with academic partners who could leverage, either maybe students could leverage scholarship funding, or professors might be able to leverage grants in order to help with funding, or as either a piece of their bigger work or as their work. It's also possible to do this kind of research as one piece of a larger project if there's a research component or an evaluation component of a larger project. It may be possible to use funding which it's targeted toward a bigger picture, and then this becomes a piece. So those are some ideas. If people are interested to have a further or more concrete discussion about a particular context, so geographic area, topic, etc., that is definitely something that we're happy to do through Community-Based Research Canada. So please get in touch with us and we can talk further about it. Does anyone want to type any final questions before we close the webinar?
I'll just add as well that contact information is up on the slide, so individuals are also welcome to reach out to me if they have any questions or want to know more about what we're doing here in Waterloo region.
Thanks, Amanda, for offering that and for offering to continue to share your expertise beyond the time of the webinar. That's awesome. So we will bring the webinar to a close. We don't have further questions, and it's 5 minutes till 1. That actually gives people a couple of minutes. We will ask you to share your feedback on a page that will pop up when the webinar is finished. And we appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to provide relevant and quality community-based research programming at Community-Based Research Canada. Just before we go, I would like to say on behalf of Community-Based Research Canada, thank you again, Amanda. It's been really informative. It's been a great learning experience today, and it's been learning about a phenomenon and an issue that is incredibly important across the country, and that we hold collective responsibility as a community to engage in prevention of. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here and participating. We will send you information about the next webinar, and we hope to connect with you again. Take care and have a great day.